Hi everyone, this is Intro to Africa at Flagler College. Today we are moving on to the period that we might call modern Africa. This is really an artificial distinction, roughly cohering with the year 1800. That tends to be how this is broken down, especially for teaching. This necessitates a change in PowerPoint as well, so we're going to ditch the brown background for a yellow one here for the rest of the semester, the rest of the term. So when we last met virtually, we were talking about the slave trade and the impact that it had over the course of about 4 centuries on Africa. And the 19th century was the time in which Africa was transitioning away from that. That doesn't mean that the slave trade stopped with the turn of the year 1800. It certainly didn't. But the winds were blowing in a different direction, as it were, and Africa was, feeling the effects of the abolitionist movements in Europe. Britain declared the abolishment of the slave trade in British territories in 1806. Again, that doesn't mean that they stopped using slaves on plantations in the Caribbean and other places, but it does mean that they stopped trading in slaves, and Britain actively began to put pressure, militarily and otherwise, on other European countries to stop trading in slaves, and this is all kind of part and parcel of the conflicts going on in Europe at the time between Napoleon and France and much of the rest of the European continent, as Napoleon would, gradually conquer most of the continent and then kind of be removed from power subsequently, finally defeated at Waterloo and consigned to exile in an island called St. Helena in the Atlantic. And so, Britain used the slave trade as one of its pieces of leverage to try to fight against Napoleon. And, after a time, France also went for abolition, and other countries followed suit later. The Portuguese were the last kind of to do this toward the end of the 19th century, the 1880s, I believe. But of course, this had an impact on Africa. The Africans were not necessarily involved in the abolition movements. These were intra-European for the most part. Of course, there were African people of African origin who were involved in the activism and sort of out there as public examples of the problems the slave trade could cause, in terms of like humanity and all of that. But on the African continent, there were still kingdoms like the ones we've mentioned before, Ashanti, Segu, and others that Dahomey, whose entire economy was really sort of geared around the slave trade, right? So this was a shock for them as the slave trade began to wind down. That the thing that they had relied on for their economic expansion, for their economic well-being, was no longer available. And so one of the things that happened, and I don't think we would in any case call this a positive consequence of abolition, is that there was probably a significant uptick in internal slavery in Africa. That is, they went away from trading, sort of forcibly went away from trading in slaves with Europeans, that Africans began to enslave each other and to use those slave laborers to farm and carry out other tasks on the continent itself. Now, Britain, and this starts in Britain and it's eventually embraced by others, began to put pressure on its African partners. And one thing that should be said here is that the Europeans really were not involved in any significant way in the interior of the continent. They controlled a few port towns, which had been, used for the purpose of trading in slaves. They construct fortresses, in different parts along the Atlantic coast. And that was pretty much all the Europeans had in terms of territory, right? They didn't really want to get into the interior of Africa previous to the 19th century. And even after they began to want to be into the interior of Africa, there were lots of obstacles that stood in the way of their actually achieving that. The biggest one by far, well, maybe I shouldn't say by far, but a really big one was malaria. Malaria was just a part of life in Africa, but Europeans were not accustomed, of course, to getting this disease. Did not do as well as those whose heredity sort of conditioned them to handle malaria better. Europeans tended to die in large numbers when they went into the interior of Africa and contracted malaria. And it wasn't until the second half of the 19th century when a drug called quinine was developed that Europeans were able to move into the interior of Africa in any significant way. And so from the coast, working with peoples in Africa who were more exposed to Europeans, the Europeans began to put pressure on Africans to engage in, sorry for the yawn, in what they called, that is the Europeans called, legitimate commerce. And there are, European treatises written at this time talking about this, about the need for Africans to go away from the slave trade and to engage in legitimate commerce, to do things that were morally acceptable. There was, of course, a lot of judgment in these things, that Africans were prone to do things that were morally suspect. Never mind, they were being pressured to do that by Europeans, but regardless, this notion of legitimate commerce really took hold and began to have an effect on Africa, because there was an international demand for certain goods, especially agricultural goods, that came from Africa. This, after all, coincides in time with the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, right? And certain African products ended up being significant to the growth of the Industrial Revolution. The number one product was palm oil and other kinds of vegetable oils. The image at the top of the slide here, the top image, shows these oil palm clusters. Okay, these bunches of essentially the fruit of the oil palm, and these things can be pressed and turned into oil. It's a very viscous oil. This is edible, and these palm trees can be used in other ways. And things fall apart, you'll read about them tapping the palm trees to produce wine, which has been a custom all over Africa, at least where there are palm trees. But the oil from the oil palm nuts was very good for providing lubrication for the machines in the Industrial Revolution. And so there was a high demand for palm oil. Europeans also introduced coffee from the New World into parts of Africa that proved to be perfect in terms of climate and conditions for growing coffee. West Africa, sorry, I must be tired. West Africa in particular, places like the Gold Coast, proved to be really good for growing coffee. And other forest products, including the beginnings of the use of rubber. rubber grows naturally in Africa in a number of different species of plants, most commonly in wild vines that grow in the rainforest, but also there are rubber trees. Rubber is the hardened sap of these various plants. So, this is at the beginning of the Industrial Revolution. Rubber was, of course, used in various ways in machines. Eventually, it would, of course, be used in huge quantities to produce tires for vehicles, right, toward the end of the 19th century. So we will come to that. Rubber plays a significant role in especially in certain parts of Africa, the rainforest region. We'll talk about the effects that the trade in rubber has on the Congo later. Now, the first Europeans to really be interested in going into the interior of Africa rather than remaining in the trading ports on the coast were missionaries, Christian missionaries. And they, frankly, had a great deal of success in terms of generating converts, but they also tended to die of malaria in large numbers, a sort of shockingly high death rate of European missionaries. But inspired by the zeal of proselytizing, they were still willing to go into what they still saw as the dark continent, and to try to find these benighted peoples with whom they could share the Christian gospel. However, so Christianity begins to be introduced in a meaningful way, a significant way, into parts of Africa, especially the western coast of Africa at this point. However, as is predictable, the Africans who embraced Christianity ended up with a very syncretic form of Christianity. Now, missionary work, truth be told, goes all the way back to the 16th century with the Jesuit order, taking Catholicism there. It's really the 18th century that Protestant missionaries begin to be interested. Toward the beginning of the 19th century, there were major efforts by various Christian sects, Catholicism as well as various Protestant sects, to convert the Africans. And from this come these figures that we might call missionary adventurers, people who were at least on the surface missionaries, but who also had a desire to find the kind of lost, as they saw it, lost treasures of the continent, to follow up on legends about Africa that circulated among Europeans. There was a major expedition. This was not a missionary per se. This was rather a scientific expedition. But there was a major expedition under the leadership of a British guy named Mungo Park, one of the all-time great names, in my opinion. I'm not sure who would look at a baby and name their child Mungo, although it does sound like a baby name, kind of nickname perhaps. But Mungo Park in the 1790s took an expedition into Africa to find what Europeans saw as the legendary, the mythical city of Timbuktu. Well, there was nothing mythical or legendary about Timbuktu. It was a place that had existed in the interior of the African continent as an Islamic scholarly center and a major center of trade, for centuries at this point. But no Europeans had at this point set eyes upon it. Mungo Park managed to reach Timbuktu, but he and most of the members of his expedition ended up dying on the way back as they were attacked, or some of them, of course, died of malaria and other diseases. And so, there were these forays into the heart of Africa. The missionary adventurer who would outstrip all of them, though, in terms of prestige, was David Livingstone, a British missionary who, beginning in the 1820s, began his nearly lifelong sojourn in Africa, trying to find, well, I mean, ostensibly to convert people to Christianity, which he did in fairly large numbers, but also to find the source of the Nile. That was the other thing that Europeans were just fascinated with. Like, where does the Nile start? Can we find the source of the Nile? Is it maybe lost in the mists that hang over the interior of Africa? There were all sorts of crazy impressions that people had about this continent. Livingstone did manage to find the headwaters of the White Nile, at least, as he found Lake Victoria. I will not say discovered. It was discovered long before that by plenty of people who lived around it. But he found the headwaters of the White Nile, and spent decades, in fact, traveling in different parts of Africa, and became really kind of the stuff of legends, almost a superhero to the British reading public. We'll come back to Livingstone later because he gets involved inadvertently in some other stuff that will concern us. Europeans also, and this is part of the abolition movement, it's kind of an outgrowth of abolition, began to form colonies on the western coast of Africa, specifically to send freed slaves back to Africa. These were places that were controlled by Europeans. Some of them had been trading centers for the slave trade, in fact. But they were founded starting in the late 18th century, really getting going in the early 19th century, to send African, native African or people of African origin who had been freed from slavery back to Africa. This was not entirely, or even in large part, an altruistic measure. There is plenty of racism involved in this quest to send Africans back to Africa. At its heart, really, the thought that Africans cannot integrate with peoples in other parts of the world, that they should not be allowed to live among people of European origin. All of that inspired the creation of these freed slave colonies, and that rhetoric would remain part of abolition, of the question about what to do with slaves for a really long time. Abraham Lincoln himself was an avid proponent of sending freed slaves back to Africa because, in his opinion, and it was shared widely all across the United States, in his opinion, Africans simply could not assimilate, and they should not be allowed to assimilate, even to attempt to assimilate, because they were just too different. People of European origin tended to have an abhorrence of even the thought of any kind of mixed race person emerging from a sexual union between a European and an African. All of these things kind of horrified them. And so, best to send Africans back to Africa. And so 1787 sees the creation of a British colony called Sierra Leone, and with its capital city called, not coincidentally here, Freetown, right? That was the name they chose. You can see from the drawing of Freetown here from a British publication in the early 19th century that this place is very European. All the buildings are European. There is a cathedral of some kind here, or a church or something. There's probably a courthouse of some kind over here, with European-style buildings dotting the landscape, right? And a lot of the rhetoric with the creation of Sierra Leone held that Europeans were trying to create little black gentlemen out of the freed slaves, and so they didn't necessarily foresee the humanitarian problems with this, right? So they created this colony and this town, sent people back there, some of whom had been, in the Americas or in Europe for generations, and they didn't necessarily envision the problem of, these people maybe needing to assimilate with the population who already lived there. Europeans were envisioning kind of westernized Africans living in Freetown, and that is in fact what they created, what they got. But these westernized Africans then did not necessarily interact well with the native peoples of that area and tended, in fact, to lord it over them. And so, this Sierra Leone really led to the creation of a highly stratified, highly hierarchical society where the freed slaves, the Europeanized or westernized peoples ended up lording it over the non-westernized natives. Something similar happened in 1822 with the creation of Liberia. This one by Americans, who were sending freed slaves to Africa. Although it remained closely tied to the U.S., really only was granted full independence in 1847 as a colony. This is, in fact, Sierra Leone was not independent at this point. It was created, but it was still tied to the British. The Americans were not interested in having any long-term commitments in Africa. So in 1847, the government of the U.S. declared that Liberia would henceforth be its own country, its own nation with its own government, and Americans just completely washed their hands of the whole project. The French created one called Libreville on the west coast of Africa in 1849. These were all kind of these freed slave colonies. Now, the British and others, especially the British, but the French are beginning to get interested too, also sort of stepped up their involvement in trade in the continent, in these goods of legitimate commerce that we talked about. And so the creation of the Gold Coast colony in what is now Ghana, as well as the European involvement in the trading city of Lagos, really got going in the first half of the 19th century. And so we really have, kind of two projects here: these freed slave colonies and economic-based colonies, mostly still on the coast, but with some increasing desire to get into the interior of Africa and reap the benefits economically that would come from that. Now, when it comes to the African perspectives here, right? So this is a pattern we're going to follow for a time here. We're going to talk about kind of European motives and European activities, and then talk about African responses and African agency. The 19th century witnesses Africa becoming integrated into a globalized trading network. The globalized trading network, of course, was created by mostly by European empires, the British Empire, the French Empire. To some extent, this had existed already from the mercantilist empires of the Dutch East India Company in the 17th century and the British East India Company in the 18th century. But the nations of Europe are creating these globalized empires that accelerate trade across the world. So Africans were responding to globalization. And they responded in ways that are really quite creative. The 19th century is a tremendously innovative time for Africa. Some of these innovations led to human atrocities. For instance, the growth of the trade in firearms, right? With the move away from the slave trade, African leaders procured I mean, they'd done this with slaves, but they continued to do this with commerce, procured firearms, as many as they could, and used those firearms in order to conquer territories and set up their own states there, right? There's also a lot of creativity when it comes to trade, that Africans were able to use their knowledge of the land, of course, to grow things that were in demand globally. They recognized the opportunities that would come from this. Some Africans grew fabulously wealthy by exploiting the trade in palm oil and other things, right? So at this point, Africans are the ones in control pretty much of the goods that they were producing for the global trade networks. Europeans have not, up until the last quarter of the 19th century, were not much involved in dictating what Africans should produce, what they should grow. That would happen with colonialism, but so Africans were, benefiting from responding to the global demand. Europeans, though, were becoming increasingly aggressive, and so the African societies that were able to be flexible and to adapt to European aggression were the ones, and even partner with Europeans, were the ones who benefited most from this. We should not see Africans as simply these passive characters in this story. They were actors. In their minds, they were taking advantage of the Europeans. And some of them were incredibly successful at doing that. Some parts of Africa, though, in the 19th century witnessed demographic stagnation. There was growth in certain areas, but others faced a lot of drought and disease. The disease, not only among humans, but in parts of Africa, diseases among cattle were much more devastating even than outbreaks of some kind of disease among human beings. In southern Africa, for instance, there were huge outbreaks of something called rinderpest, which killed off massive herds of cattle, thus removing from the Africans their central source of wealth and status in their societies, and this was highly disruptive and allowed, in the Southern African case, Europeans to take greater advantage of their weakened state, to take more territory from them. There were also periodic droughts and famines, and this is probably a cycle that has persisted in Africa for all of its history. But it becomes more apparent to the world because kind of European observers document this, right? So drought and disease definitely has an effect. Some areas of the continent, though, especially those like in West Africa that were benefiting from increased involvement in the globalized trade network, actually grew demographically and economically. And so, there is this kind of mix of success, we might say, in Africa in the 19th century, that some parts of the continent are really doing well, really advancing. Other parts of the continent are facing serious challenges, serious problems. So regional diversity, understandably, as always, is kind of the key to doing justice to African history here. All right. Now, Islam and Christianity also play a significant role in this period. The advance of European Christianity with the activities of missionaries, and also a kind of resurgence in the Sahel region, in particular, of Islam. And also in North Africa, there are new movements in Islam that really animate the Islamic society, and we'll talk about those. Okay, so what I have done here in these first two slides, okay, is to lay out the kind of the basics of the period that we're looking at. In this case, the first half or first 3/4 of the 19th century. And then we're going to proceed from there. So taking all of those general comments, proceed from there to look at regional examples. We're not going to be absolutely comprehensive in this. We're not going to look at every single region. We'll break it down by the major regions: North Africa, West Africa, East Africa, and Southern Africa, and in some cases Eastern and Southern Africa are kind of lumped in together. And that will be the way that we proceed. As we get into the more modern period with the creation of African nations, we will then look at a specific nation or two in each region of Africa. And so this again, this will not be absolutely exhaustive, but hopefully this will give a flavor of different parts of the continent. So I want to finish up this particular part of the lecture by looking at, or this particular lecture, I should say, by looking at North Africa. And I will break this 19th century period up into two lectures. The second one will deal with the other regions of the continent. So first, North Africa. North Africa, most of it at least, the parts along the Mediterranean, were incorporated at the beginning of the 19th century into the Ottoman Empire. This had been the case from, parts of it going all the way back to the 16th and 17th centuries. Egypt had become part of the Ottoman Empire. The 18th century, or the 17th century, was really the heyday of the Ottomans, the point of their greatest expansion and their greatest effectiveness, but the Ottomans were still hanging on as a massive land-based empire at the beginning of the 19th century. Land-based empire. Really, the Ottomans are the last of the great land-based empires that go all the way back to, we could go all the way back to the Assyrian Empire of the 8th century BCE. A land-based empire is an empire where land is key, right? Where the empire tries to control as much land as possible in order to tax as many peasants as it possibly can. As opposed to what emerges in the 19th century and to some extent back in the 18th century with these European sea-based empires, where the control of land territory is not nearly as important as control of the sea lanes, which give them the absolute corner on the globalized market in the trade of goods, right, which have to be shipped from one part of the world to another via boat. And so the Ottomans are a kind of throwback to the earlier form of empire, even the ancient form of empire, and the last one to kind of try to hold on to that identity. And so, so that, if that helps us understand the Ottoman Empire, this is not a class on the Ottoman Empire. It's just but it is involved heavily in North Africa. Now, North Africa was divided into provinces, which by the early 19th century were functioning semi-autonomously. These were led by provincial officials. In Egypt and Tunis, they were called the Beys, the Bey of Egypt, the Bey of Tunis. In Algeria, the term was Dey, and I think that these correspond with, in Egypt and Tunis, they're speaking Arabic. In Algeria, they're speaking, this may be a kind of Berberized form of that. I'm not sure, to be truthful. These may be Turkish terms. So I probably shouldn't comment on something I honestly don't know where it comes from. I'm not sure why one is called Bey and one is called Dey. So maybe you can look that up. I don't know. There were also under the Beys and Deys, there were military nobles. And so this is very much a kind of military hierarchy that exists in these provinces. But just as important economically were urban merchants in places like Cairo and Tunis and Algiers that procured a great deal of wealth from trade. Some of this trade activity was not exactly legal. There was a great deal of piracy that came out of these provincial places, supported by the beys and days who got a cut, in some cases, of the activities, the loot that the pirates were able to procure. This is one of the things, by the way, that led to the creation of the United States Navy. U.S. merchant ships, and this is just a few years into the creation of the United States, but U.S. merchant ships going into the Mediterranean tended to be waylaid by these pirates coming from the North African coast, again, supported by the beys and days of the provincial governors of the Ottoman Empire. And, around 1800 or so, with the merchant ships being seized, and the beys and days were demanding tribute from the U.S. in order to keep the pirates at bay. This is one of the ways that they they got money. This is one of their chief kind of economic activities. And in the U.S., there was a call to create warships to protect merchant vessels. And the slogan to this was millions for defense, but not 1 cent for tribute. And so they built several warships, including most famously the USS Constitution. That same ship is still in Boston Harbor, though of course it's been restored numerous times. In this shot here, you have Captain Bainbridge of the U.S. Navy delivering to the Dey of Algiers the last tribute with the message that the U.S. was no longer going to pay this, that they were going to protect their ships with their own navy, right? So, so Africa was bound up with the creation of that part of the U.S. military. But rising European economic might began to eclipse many of the activities of these North African communities. And at the same time, in North Africa, partly due to a number of factors, some of them climatic and environmental, there was demographic stagnation all through the early 19th century. And so there's this kind of mixed record. For the most part, North Africa is in some decline, right? Definitely the Ottoman system was a mess by this point. These provincial governors functioning again semi-autonomously made a living by extracting money from piracy and other things, but with the Europeans gaining a greater and greater share of the power on the world stage, the Ottoman governors simply couldn't keep up, and in some cases that system was supplanted and overthrown. Sorry for the strange animations here. Egypt is a good case of the weakening influence of the Ottoman Empire, maybe the best case, in fact. Napoleon, who was still at this point just a military leader in the French army, although he was technically Corsican, right? He didn't even come from France proper. But he, at the head of an army, French army, really in some defiance of the wishes of the French Republic. This is shortly after the French Revolution, of course. Napoleon invaded Egypt. And this demonstrated that the Ottomans were in absolutely no condition to oppose European expansion. Napoleon overran the garrison stationed there. The Ottomans were not able to muster any kind of response. Napoleon hung on there for a time, really to extract concessions from from the French government and from other Europeans, in some ways as a show of force of his own intentions. And Napoleon would then go back to Europe and proceed to conquer much of the continent. But in Africa, this simply showed the ineffectiveness of the Ottomans, right? And this led to the overthrow of the Beys by other military nobles, including, most importantly, a Turkish noble named Mohammed Ali Pasha, who in 1805 became the de facto ruler of Egypt. He was technically still an Ottoman provincial official, but Muhammad Ali Pasha did not listen to anything that was coming from the Sultan in Istanbul. And for the next more than 4 decades, Muhammad Ali Pasha would rule Egypt. And he saw that the Europeans were outstripping everything that the Ottomans and others were doing. And he decided that in order to draw Egypt into the modern world, he really needed to make some serious changes. That he needed to copy European models. Muhammad Ali Pasha is one of the most significant figures, not only in Egyptian history, but I think he's one of the real giants of 19th century Africa, showing the really quite creative response that Africans could have to these increasingly globalized pressures placed on them. And so he embarked on, among other things, a massive program of industrialization. He sent people to Europe to sort of observe how the Europeans had created factories and industrial machines. He purchased some of these, tried to get industry going in Egypt. He also sought to modernize agriculture. People were still, digging with sticks and shovels and things, doing pretty much all of the farm laboring by manual labor. He envisioned an increasingly mechanized agriculture and tried to put that into effect. He sent a lot of elite young men, in particular, to European universities, to try to get an education to understand, how they could modernize even more. Though this was met with some skepticism by the Egyptians, because there were also things happening culturally in Egypt at the time that led to the partial rejection of Muhammad Ali Pasha's desire to Europeanize Egypt. Militarily, he embarked on expansion, particularly to the south into Nubia. He sent military expeditions up the Nile, which means to the south, of course, conquered parts of the Sudan, and this led to a kind of backlash by the native Nubian peoples there that would grow over time. But there was this intimate connection from this point on between Egypt and the Sudan region. Now, partly in defiance of Muhammad Ali Pasha's desire to modernize, but also to some extent taking cues from his programs of increasing education and everything, there is this movement, we might call it, that some have called the Egyptian Enlightenment, that happens in the early 19th century, or I shouldn't say just the early 19th century, sort of over the whole course of the 19th century. And again, some of this is rejecting the westernization that Muhammad Ali Pasha was trying to introduce into Egypt. The center point, really kind of the locus of the Egyptian Enlightenment, was the Al-Azhar Mosque in Cairo, which was already an institution of the highest standing within Islamic scholarly circles. But it became the locus for this, for moving in new directions. And one of the outgrowths of the activities of the Al-Azhar Mosque, though it's not just there, it's other places, but that really, again, is the locus, is what is known as the Salafia movement. Salafia movement. And this takes its cues from to some extent from the work of the 18th century Arabian scholar Muhammad ibn Abd al-Wahhab, the Wahhabi or the Wahhabist idea of Islam, which was more of a fundamentalist take, rejecting religious innovations. The Salafists in Egypt accept some of the teachings of al-Wahhab and end up taking it, in some cases, even further than he had. The Wahhabists and the Salafis are the forerunners of the fundamentalist movements of the 20th and 21st centuries. Though, of course, we can't necessarily draw a direct line from what was going on in Egypt in the early 19th century to, Al-Qaeda and the Muslim Brotherhood and some of these other things. In fact, we'll talk about the Muslim Brotherhood. They have origins almost 100 years ago. But in any case, this is the Salafia movement really is all about trying to get back to original Islam, to go back to Islam as it was constituted in the 7th and 8th centuries during the time of Muhammad and his companions, and thus doing away with all of the, as they saw it, accretions or unwelcome additions that had been heaped upon the original teachings of the Prophet, doing away with practices that were not germane to that early Islamic situation. And so this is the desire. This is what the Salafists are trying to do. And that is, of course, going to snowball over time. Now, Muhammad Ali Pasha's programs of westernization and modernization did not really succeed. I mean, they did move Egypt in a modernist direction, but there was, of course, some resistance by people in Egypt. These, traditionalist Muslims didn't like this because it was, these were religious accretions as they saw it. The nobles who exercised power in locally and regionally under Muhammad Ali Pasha wanted their cut of things of the industrialization, and so that blunted the effect of it to some extent. And increasingly, the Europeans were functioning in North Africa in ways that were highly manipulative of the local economy. Europeans were already trying to broker deals with these nobles to get really kind of sweetheart contracts on Egyptian goods, especially cotton. Egypt was, and still is today, in fact, one of the most important cotton-producing regions of the world. The cotton that is grown in Egypt is of the highest quality. You may have seen, if you've been in a store that sells such things, sheet sets and other things that say 100% Egyptian cotton, right? Because it is soft and breathable and all of that. And so Europeans were already kind of trying to undercut the efforts of Muhammad Ali Pasha, undercut the Egyptian economy and get in on the ground floor, so to speak, right? So the other problem, and the thing that really ultimately led to the failure of these programs of Muhammad Ali Pasha, was that he had to take out loans from Europeans, European governments, European banks, massive loans to try to float the industrialization projects. And when the Egyptians reached a point that the debt was just so great, they had to give in to European demands. Now, this didn't necessarily happen under Muhammad Ali Pasha, though by the end of his life in 1848, it was pretty obvious, probably even to him, that this had not gone as well as he desired. But under his heirs in the second half of the 19th century, Europeans were able to pretty much take whatever they wanted from Egypt, including in the building of the Suez Canal and other things in the 1860s. And so the debts became crushing. And ultimately Egypt was not able to achieve, the desire that Muhammad Ali Pasha had to reach a point where Egypt would be on par with European industrialized economies. They simply failed to do that. Another example that is, and this isn't North Africa per se, I mean, Ethiopia is kind of its own thing. But Ethiopia also sees a sort of resurgence in the 19th century of its former glories. All through the 16th, 17th, 18th, into the 19th century, Ethiopia had been fragmented politically between various provincial warlords who exercised, and these were Christians, but also with repeated Islamic incursions into Ethiopia, driving the Ethiopians further and further into the highlands, really cutting off their contact with the coast. And so this was the state of Ethiopia for several centuries. In the 1850s, under an Egyptian leader who tapped into the old Solomonic dynasty, the claim that the Egyptian emperor was, descended directly from King Solomon of ancient Israel, and from Menelik, his legendary son. The emperor the king, call him the Emperor Theodros, managed to consolidate power under himself. He was one of these provincial warlords, and he sort of rose up and took charge and brought a unification of, or a consolidation of power. There was still a great deal of warring between different factions, but he held the lion's share of the power. Under his, and this was not his son, Theodros felt that he was a failure toward the end of his life, and there was a return for some time to a kind of anarchy. But the second emperor, significant emperor, was Johannes, starting in 1872, managed to go down the path that Theodros had trodden upon, as it were, and he did succeed by the end of his reign in reunifying all of the different regions of Ethiopia. And so there was once more a kind of empire in Ethiopia, a Christian empire there. Ethiopia achieved its greatest advancement, though, under Johannes's son, Menelik, who is pictured here on the slide. This upper one is Muhammad Ali Pasha, a painting of him, and then this is a photograph of the Ethiopian Emperor Menelik, and you can see the ceremonial robes and crown and everything that he had. Some of this, to some extent, imitating European things, but also with some traditional African motifs and forms incorporated into it. Menelik was the Ethiopian equivalent of Muhammad Ali Pasha, though in some ways he was even more successful at modernizing. He managed to procure from the Europeans, in fact, some advanced weaponry, which other African leaders, and in fact other leaders in other parts of the world, were unsuccessful at procuring. Menelik even secured in the 1890s a number of machine guns. The machine gun was in development and really kind of perfected by a British gunmaker named Hiram Maxim. Coincidentally, I am filming this from London, and I was at the Imperial War Museum the other day. If you're watching this in a later semester, this won't be applicable sort of chronologically, but I was at the Imperial War Museum the other day observing some of the original Maxim guns. Really, really interesting stuff. Sorry for the personal anecdotes there. Anyway, Menelik was able to procure some of these machine guns, some advanced weaponry, and in the 1890s, and we're sort of getting ahead of ourselves here, but Europeans were scrambling to claim parts of Africa and to invade them militarily, to impose rule over them. Well, the Italians decided to invade Ethiopia, thinking that they had this long-standing claim, because Ethiopians were Christian and in some ways Catholic after all. And so they invaded Ethiopia in the 1890s, and Menelik was able to use his modernized, industrialized weaponry to defeat the Ethiopians at the Battle of Adwa in 1896. So that's just, one really good example of the modernization that Ethiopia was able to achieve under Menelik. Ethiopia really is functioning independently and in increasingly modernized ways in this period. In some ways, we could say it's the most advanced of all the African states at this point, though we'd have to, I guess, impose the right criteria to do that. Okay. One final point, another thing with North Africa. The French, starting in the first half of the 19th century, become really interested in controlling parts of North Africa, and they succeed in obtaining more or less possession of both Algeria and Morocco, dealing a death blow to the final kind of Ottoman pretensions to control Algeria, which had, for a long time been mostly autonomous. The French control Algeria, and Algeria will become a very important part of the French Empire, a unique part of the French Empire eventually, because of its proximity to France itself. And so that's the way things are trending, right? A desire on the part of Africans to modernize and westernize to some extent, but also increasing European aggression on the African continent. Okay. So we'll move on next time and talk about West Africa and then talk about Eastern and Southern Africa in this same period. Look forward to that. Thanks.